Okay. So last week, or like last session, we sort of did a broad overview of how music. Oh, no, I don't want you playing. No, thank you. Um, how music plays a role, and specifically Jewish music plays a role in justice work, right? In the ways in which um we can be supporters of justice, and how it's deeply built into our texts. We looked at Isaiah, and we looked at, if you recall, this is not the fast that I desire, right? Looking at that little portion of text that we read on Yom Kippur, and how that relates to the need for justice work. And then we talked a little bit about the ways in which, hello, Sue, the ways in which then that justice work began to play into some of the experiences of Jewish writers. And we listened to an excerpt of a song that was written around the time of MLK's passing, and as like a call to justice. So today we're going to get into some of the music of the women's suffrage movement, as well as learning a little bit more about the Der Arbeiterring, the workman's circle, and the music of them and how that relates to justice, and just listening to different ways in which we as Jews interpret the need for justice work through music. So we spoke a little bit about the background of the women's suffrage movement last session. And so I want to focus now on specifically the women's suffrage procession of 1913. So that came on Monday, March 3rd, 1913. Okay. This comes on the tail end of the shirtwaist factory fire, in which we had hundreds of young women and girls passing away, most of which were Jews or Italian immigrants, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants. And it led to a lot of protests and spurred some initiatives towards workers' justice, towards the idea that people deserve rights when they're in a factory. Many of the deaths could have been prevented had doors not been blocked, for example, right? And so there were certain exits that were blocked. And so these poor women were trapped inside. So here's the background of this march. It was held one day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson in his first term. And there were already a ton of people in DC for that event. So this was really good timing for them. There was already kind of a mass, and the timing maximized attendance and attention from the media and from people who were living in the area. There were over 5,000 women who marched in this procession, over 20 different parade floats. You can kind of see one here, the very fancy attired horses and things like that. And there were 9 bands and 4 mounted brigades. So 4 different brigades of horsemen who marched in this. I mean, I would call it a parade as well as a processional, right? However, during this march, marchers were jostled, they were tripped, they were attacked, and over 100 women were hospitalized. Police just basically were hands off during this. They didn't put their toe in the ring either way to offer protection or any sort of brutality. So it was just like, no, we don't know what's going on with the thousands of people who are in the streets right now. What? No. So they really turned a blind eye. Okay. So regardless of this, as women are being hurt and are being transported to the hospital, over 5,000 women still finished the march. So they completed this processional. It's not clear how many of those women were Jews, but it was organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which had a pretty strong Jewish participation, including a woman named Maud Nathan, who was a very prominent suffragist and was avowedly Jewish as well as avowedly a suffragist. and the Yiddish language newspapers from New York, which usually had a very like religious perspective and mostly Yiddish speakers and those who were in the very Orthodox community. There were about 70,000 subscribers to Yiddish Tagblatt, which is the Jewish daily news. They covered the whole procession. And so the writers were there following the procession and published it. So even the most Orthodox were receiving the news of this particular suffrage procession. When it came to the music of this time frame, there were a lot of songs that were written at the time, but one of the most prominent ones in support, written in the 1910s, was written by a Jewish composer named Herman Paley with lyrics by Alfred Bryan. They were Jewish and Irish, and they collaborated together. And it's a song called "She's Good Enough to Be Your Baby's Mother, and She's Good Enough to Vote With You." I love it. So this is the name of the song, and I love the kind of sarcastic, funny tone of that particular song, right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to listen to a version of it. They had us listening to the 1916 recording of it. The challenge with the 1916 recording is, even with my young ears, I was having some trouble understanding the lyrics. So I decided that we would listen to a different version of it. But while we listen, I want you to, if you hear a lyric that sticks out to you, if you're online, you can type it into the chat. If you hear something that spurs that's interesting, right? Or if you have a specific reaction as you're happening in the moment. For those of us who are here in person, we've got Sue and Paulette. If something comes to mind, you can either jot it down or just hold on to it, and then we're going to kind of discuss what we feel hearing this particular song, right? What were they trying to say by, writing it in this way? So I really like this version of the song. I just need to find, there we go. This is an album that was written.
Stop stuffing sopping wet bags of ice into your cooler.
Really?
I've got a brand new fridge on wheels that keeps your food ice cold without ever needing.
And I'll pause it. This is an album written in centennial tribute to women's suffrage. It's called Shoulder to Shoulder. And it has artists like Harry Belafonte, all sorts of other wonderful choirs and really interesting music. And so this one is sung by Karen Allison, I believe, and her sextet. And it's just really upbeat. If we're still having trouble understanding the lyrics, there is a slower version with the words underneath that I can play, but I really love how upbeat hers is. And so we're going to listen to it first and see what we can do there. And then I'm going to also make sure that I optimize my screen share for that video clip so that hopefully we can hear it. Now, if those of you online are having trouble hearing, please just pop out and say, "I can't hear." Here we go.
No man is greater than his mother. No man is half so good. No man is better than the wife he loves. Her love will guide him, whatever betide him. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else would kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you are lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother. And she's good enough to vote with you. the world in war and sadness. She must protest in vain. Let's hope and pray someday we'll hear her say, stop all this madness, I bring you gladness. She's good enough to give you old Abe Lincoln. She's good enough to give you Brandon Sherman, Robert E. Lee, and Washington too. She was so true, she gave them to you. She's good enough to give you Teddy Roosevelt, Thomas A. Edison too. She's good enough to give you Woodrow Wilson. And she's good enough to vote with you.
Right?
Cute.
Yeah. So I love that version. There are others that are slower, ones that are, you know,
I can't help it. Yes.
good heavens.
Was that an all-man band?
Was that a what?
An all-male orchestra?
Was that an all-male orchestra? I don't know who is in her sextet. That is a good question. So when we look, if you were to look at Shoulder to Shoulder, you could see
Up for epic?
the
Start with a
it's the Karen Allison sextet. So you could look it up. Let's see. It actually doesn't say. It doesn't say. So but that whole album is different suffrage music from the same period of time. What were some of your impressions of the lyrics themselves?
So she's good enough. She's good enough to give birth to these great men like Abraham Lincoln. She's not great, but she's okay to give birth to great men. Like, that's a little weird. She's only good enough. She's not as great as the great men she gave birth to.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. She gave you Robert E. Lee. She gave you Lincoln. She's good enough to vote, guys. Like, this is a pretty straightforward idea. Other thoughts? Good.
It's a funny basis
Yeah.
for giving women the vote. I
Right.
think women should have the vote for sure, but it just it's kind of a funny approach to the rationale for why women should be able to vote.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
you have to be there to appreciate it.
Well, it might be partially on purpose, right? Maybe the way to get men to listen is to present it in a comical fashion, right? Because
Correct.
the serious arguments weren't pushing through, right? Oftentimes in pursuit of justice, we have to think about creative ways for those in power to listen to us, right?
And
Brian,
you're saying there was an effort to give women the vote well before this.
we talked about it. There was in some circles there was an effort to, right? But music was one of the means in which their voices could be heard, right?
Sure.
If this was played popularly, even if it caused a chuckle, it also might plant something in a lawmaker's brain, right?
Quite true.
And Brian, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm looking at the fact that women have all this strength to give birth to these great men, so they should have the strength in order to overcome this and get their right to vote. And to answer Gerald as well, historically, this is the push for the national right to vote, but there are many states prior to that had the right to vote in their constitutions as they became part of the United States or even afterwards. So this movement, I think, is just a national one compared to what we've seen in the other states.
Oh,
So,
good.
Yeah, I believe we talked about that a couple weeks ago. There were certain states that as part of membership, they already had it. Brilliant. Yes, Brian, thank you.
And I think he used the word pushed out, just the last thing he said, and it goes hand in hand with pushing out the babies. And so it's, yeah.
They use some really clever turns of phrase,
Yeah.
right? And that's the amazing thing about lyricists and writers, the ways in which they can create a picture with the music and the lyrics that they choose to help push their point, right? Their whatever their agenda is, they're going to do their best to find a way for us to remember it. And sometimes that can be mildly racy or a little bit
Graphic.
suggestive, right? And that's great because then again, it sticks in your head. This is a catchy tune, right? This was a very popular tune during the time. And so it helped to push the point. It got the point across, right? So what was the result? The result is that obviously we get major news stories, we get congressional coverage. We end up seeing that this procession is credited for giving the suffrage movement a new wave of inspiration and purpose nationally. And then eventually we ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920, which codifies women's right to vote nationally, not just in certain states in which the Constitution guaranteed it. So now we're going to move into our next stage of the game, which is discussing specifically Yiddish culture and workers' rights and economic justice. As was explained, when it comes to this particular unit, we are not going chronologically. We'll talk based upon broad themes, broad ideas, and the writers and musicians that connect to those broad themes and ideas. But we will bounce around in terms of time frames. I mean, we started with MLK and then jumped into 1913, right? So I just want to remind you, and I will every time that we go through one of these lessons, don't expect us to be going chronologically. I think it'll drive you bananas if you think that's how we're going. So now we're going to talk a little about Yiddish culture in the third wave of immigration, give or take a little bit. So about 2 million Eastern European Jews, mostly Eastern European Jews, are among the more than 20 million people who entered the US during the third wave of immigration, which is from 1880 to around 1920. This is in addition to the about 250,000 Jews who had previously immigrated in the first and second wave from Central Europe. So in the 1920s, once we have this wave of Jews, Yiddish culture was such that they had a number of Yiddish newspapers across the country, circulating hundreds of thousands of newspapers every day. And they had Yiddish theaters on 2nd Avenue in New York City, which seated thousands of people every single night. A huge Yiddish cultural boon in the 1920s, mostly situated in New York, but also around the country. Also, Yiddish culture becomes a part of American entertainment and cuisine and business and speech and politics, all across the various areas of the arts. We discussed that a lot when we looked at jazz age Jews, right? When we were looking in the 20s and the ways in which Yiddish culture seeped in to many different areas. Yes, Gerald?
Yes, I just want to mention, I do remember as a very small child, I remember seeing my grandfather reading the Vorwärts, which was the Yiddish daily, and the standard joke was it means forward, but it's written backwards because it's Yiddish right to left. So
You're exactly right. And actually now their Vorwärts is the forward and we can still receive it today. Now it's written in English, but you actually, I receive the forward. And so I pay, my subscription fee and it comes digitally. But they are still around today. Yeah. And really focus still on, Jewish issues from around the nation and around the world. So, it is sad they did stop publishing in Yiddish a number of years.
Sorry to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Not that I could read it.
yeah, not that many of us could, which is of course another conversation for another time. So, So why do I explain that there was this big Yiddish boom? Well, why did all these immigrants come? Why did all these immigrants come? Many left their home countries because of prejudice and violence and poverty. And so when they got to America, many of these immigrants supported the ideas of workers' rights, economic justice, things that would, relate to their own personal struggles, right? And so one of the main groups that was formed during this time was called the Arbiter Ring, or Worker Circle. Sometimes it used to be called the Workmen's Circle, right? Workmen's Circle. There was still one in Los Angeles up until a few years ago. I don't know if it's still there. But I used to go to Tu B'Av, and Tisha B'Av services there, actually, Tisha B'Av. So what was the Workmen's Circle, or Arbiter's Ring? It began as a mutual aid society in 1900 in New York City. And then it grew to kind of become an organization focused on the socialist view that social justice and economic justice is a vital part of every Jew and American's needs in the world. So it began to create schools and cultural programming and educational programming. They helped found many of the local unions, specifically, and we can see in the picture here, the garment district unions, the ladies' waist and dressmakers union. This was supported by and guided by the Arbiter Ring, and many of the members of this union were also members of the Workmen's Circle. They also promoted Yiddish culture and social justice values through their songs. They had camps. I think my great-grandfather, he used to support the Workmen's Circle camps. There were Workmen's Circle camps in Los Angeles and all across the United States. And they also supported the arts. So they created orchestras and singing groups designed to spread we would say now, I suppose, socialist values of, or the ideas of social reform, so as to support all of the people, all of the workmen, all of the workers, right? So we're gonna listen to one of their songs, if it'll move to the slide, perhaps. Haha. Fancy, right? I just look at that and I see Greek, but Der Arbeiterhymnen, the hymn of the Workmen's Circle, or the hymn of the Worker Circle. The anthem announces its populist agenda, which is the unions are anvil and shield, while the chorus closes with an affirmation of what is the working class ideal. So this song is very representative of many of the songs that were created during this time frame to support workers' rights and economic justice. This was the music was written by a man named Meyer Posner, who was born in 1890 and lived until 1931. And his melody was the contest winner for 1925, set to a poem by a guy named Avram Leeson, who was a socialist whose activism forced him to emigrate to the United States in 1897. So he had written this and then got in trouble for his beliefs and emigrated to the United States. Leeson's poetry is kind of he pulls from many different models of revolutionaries from Jewish history, including Bar Kokhba and Judah Maccabee and Rabbi Akiva, many different people who had deep feelings about justice and about what it means to be a hero in a Jewish space. So we're going to listen to Der Arbeiter Hymnen and see what we think. Unless it doesn't actually play. Are we going to play? No. Nope, that's Open the Gates. Of course it is. Because links are what they are. So hold on. I checked all of them and then of course they went away. All the links disappeared. Nope, none of that is right. So hold on. The Hymn of the Workman's Circle. We'll try it in English.
I want to restyle him and the.
Yeah, of course. It usually, here's the thing. It usually does it anyway. All right. No, that's the youth anthem.
Hi, I'm Nicole Hockley from Sandy Hook Promise. I know this is hard to hear, but it's important. The shooter who murdered.
It's always fun when you can't find it. But we'll listen to the youth one and see if it's close enough. Can you hear it? So you can hear the sort of back and forth, right? Gerald, you had a thought?
But, well, it started getting repetitious.
Yeah, which most hymns would, right? This is a call and response, right?
Right.
This is an understanding that we support the youth in their struggles and with love, right? and there were a lot of youth who were stuck in the early days of labor, not being supported, right? A lot of
Right.
child labor law issues.
Yes.
And so, in addition to just the general hymns of the Workmen's Circle, they wrote many pieces in support of children and in support of their rights as well. And so, in albums like this, in Love and in Struggle, when you see the legacy of the Jewish Labor Bund, this was a group of people who were dedicated to justice in every aspect of the word, right? Wherever there was struggle, wherever there was strife for the workers, the Workmen's Circle spoke out in support, right? In support of the workers. So how do we honor, this is just a big broad question now, as we move into our next section. Oh, I gotta click to exit full screen. Sure. Before we move into the March in Washington, just a question. How do we honor social justice heroes of yesteryear, of the people who, for the gains they help usher in, whether it be in the area of voting rights or economic justice? Are there ways in which we still today honor these people and remember them? Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I remember Susan B. Anthony, they made a coin for her. And so that's commemorating her, what she did in terms of the suffrage movement. So, and holidays, commemoration days type of thing.
Do we have a holiday for the workers?
Yeah, it's called Labor Day.
Yeah. Good.
Like most holidays, it's just another day off for almost everybody.
Unfortunately, that's what it's become. So,
and that's the concern, right? So if you were to run the world, here's my question to you. What would a Jewish Labor Day look like? What
I
sort
would
of
say, I'd say it's a celebration, a party. Everyone should just party and just feel good about what's been done and what we've accomplished.
But maybe also, maybe also some educational elements, because most of us don't know this history.
How about typically with Labor Day today, where unions have functions, do picnics with the family?
That's the party.
Yeah. But it's focused on the family and friends.
Sure.
It reminds me of MLK and the Martin Luther King Day, which tries to celebrate, which used to celebrate his movement for equality for blacks, right? But the trouble is, nowadays nobody mentions what he did, because all the values today, or all the current ones, are going against what he wanted. It was like,
refocusing the labor movement, or the Labor Day, with a more heavy focus on, the celebratory aspects of what they were fighting for, right?
huh?
MLK Day has, parades and has honoring to him and some of his, in some circles, right? In Los Angeles, it's pretty careful. And they have days of service, right? And they have a day of service for MLK Day, things like that. If we were to have a Jewish Labor Day, having a big picnic and doing some sort of work in the world, right, that connects to justice, might make it more meaningful, right? And might bring it back to it. Having some educational components, like Janine said, coming together initially and showing, short little video clips of different, Jewish labor workers, right? People who were leaders in the movements of the various unions and what made them so influential, right? And what gains have been made because of Jews in this arena. And then going out into the world and yourself doing those acts of good and support, right? Oftentimes, I think we take for granted the work of those who came before us, right? We have certain protections because of people that were a part of these organizations, the Workmen's Circle being one very prominent one, right? Those who spoke out against injustice helped us. And oftentimes we do, we take that for granted. So all of these are just interesting things to chew over as we sort of think about what it means to celebrate Labor Day.
It might be even more topical now that there's so much anti-Semitism, especially being even professed and practiced in so many of the colleges and universities.
Absolutely. Being more public and open about the work that has been done in the justice arenas by Jews is more timely than ever. Absolutely. Absolutely. And to counterbalance what may or may not be said on a campus or in other places, it could go either way. You know, could cause more sparks than or cause a fire, or it could quench a thirst. All things to consider. So now, speaking a little bit of Martin Luther King, right? And that justice movement. We're going to move on to that. It works well. Like I said, jumping around time frames, but themes. We're going with themes.
Mhm.
So now we're going to talk about the March for Washington. March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Okay. Happens over 50 years later. Well, actually about 50 years later, right? It is the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. And planning begins in March 1963, then gains steam on May 3rd when Bull Connor unleashes the high-powered fire hoses in Birmingham. He was the segregationist commissioner of public safety. And he unleashed these terrible fire hoses onto a children's march. So there were youth and young people and their parents. He sets German shepherds upon them, and white onlookers were allowed to basically have their way with them with very little police intervention. So when that happens, it becomes national news, of course, and sort of fuels the fire for the need to march, for the need to demand voting rights, and to the need to support those who were underserved based upon the color of their skin. So included in the planning committee for this March on Washington is a man named Arnie Aronson. And he actually just recently passed away in 1998. I guess it's not that recent anymore. It still feels recent, right? He was the Jewish co-founder of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. And he was their executive director until 1980. And so he was a huge part of lobbying campaigns for the Civil Rights Act in 57 and 64, and in 65, the Voting Rights Act, and in 68, the Fair Housing Act. Jews have always been a very integral part of the fight for racial justice and equality. So what were some of the goals of this march? What were some of the goals of this march? Let me see if it. They wanted to end segregated public accommodations. They wanted to protect the right to vote for all people, address violations of constitutional rights, desegregate all public schools, train and place unemployed workers, and bar discrimination in unemployment. They wanted a Fair Federal Employment Practices Act barring discrimination. Do you think any of these goals have, which of these goals have been met?
Segregation in schools.
Yes.
Brown versus Board of Education.
Mm-hmm. Although Heather brings up a good point, you know, yes, it is codified that there are no specific segregated
Right.
schools, but they feel in many areas still very segregated, right?
Of course, yeah.
Based upon, yeah, economic lines, really.
You know, it's a sort of. We've sort of ended it, but we still got it. We have discrimination in employment. We have the schools aren't really all desegregated. Constitutional rights got attacked. Now we have people trying to figure out how to suppress voting in certain neighborhoods. We still have the same problems. We only have difference now. We have a legal structure, and we have a Department of Justice who can, in some case, deal with these problems instead of having to have to, like it was in the old days, demonstrations, boycotts, and everything else.
There's another factor, and that is in colleges now, there's still segregation in that there are black dormitories and white dormitories. And why that happens, why that is, it is just fostering segregation. And I don't know why we're still having that kind of thing. It just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, people want to feel like I'm with my own color, you know. I mean, how about my own values? You know, it just it just doesn't compute for me.
So there's still some desires in different realms for like just being with your own people. I mean, even back during this time frame, there were arguments for and against segregation. You know, one of the things that they said is separate yet equal would have been fine had that also meant that everyone got the same materials and got the same everything, right? And it's not just about the color being separate, but if everything actually was equal. There were many prominent Black activists that were okay with that. And some of the HBCUs, some of those historically Black colleges, were created under that idea and still are to this day. So is everything ended? No, absolutely not. But here's my question to you. Should our Jewish community be involved in helping to effectuate progress in any of these areas? Or is this not our realm?
Oh, absolutely, we need to. We need to make sure justice is served, no matter who it is, all human beings.
Huntington Beach is trying to change the vote, the right to vote, and we're working on making sure they don't do that.
So what actions can our community be involved in then? And what types of things, if at all, should we refrain from? So Heather says there should be no refraining because we should be working on as many of these goals as possible.
Well, I think maybe if we refrain from thinking that we know how they feel, because we don't. So that might be something that we would, you know, listen, but not expect to feel like they feel, whoever it is being.
So what Sue said, in case those online can't hear, is that the way we refrain is the way in which we show our empathy. We have to be careful when we empathize with and fight for the rights of those that are not having the same experience as we are. We can empathize with them, we can listen to them, but we must ask them what they need before jumping in, right? Otherwise we risk being the Jewish savior, right? So not the white savior, right? Is the idea. There has to be a balance between recognizing the problem and acknowledging who is suffering in that situation, and then supporting them in the ways in which they need to be supported. So having an open dialogue with them is sort of where Sue was going, and hearing them, and also acknowledging that our experience is not their experience. So we have to be very careful and tread lightly when it comes to the ways in which we engage in our justice work, right? The ways in which we approach someone who is on the street and homeless when we have a roof over our heads should be different than the ways in which we approach someone who also has a roof over their heads and is coming to CBT with us and lives in our neighborhood, right? So there needs to be a level of understanding that as we engage in this justice work, we must do so with empathy and with an understanding that if we're going to address violations of constitutional rights, well, if we already have that constitutional right, we'd better engage respectfully and openly with the person who does not, or with the group that does not.
Well, there are, understand that there are many of the homeless that choose to live in tents on a parkway, on a highway, as opposed to going ahead and getting a job and getting off of drugs, and having a home. They can have that. But
Perhaps,
not
but
to.
I'll stop you there because that's an opinion, and we're not gonna
No,
debate
it's not an
opinions
opinion.
here.
It's not an opinion. It is a fact.
Mute him.
It's part of the data.
Okay, so here's where then what we would need to do either way. We still need to come at them with a level of empathy as Jews. And that's where I'll stop on that, is that no matter what their choices are, we want to make sure that we're coming at them with with empathy and understanding. There may be many factors that go into that choice versus going into other situations like the shelters, which are overcrowded as well. And there are many possible things. And again, that can get into a realm of political action that we're not going to really dive into too much here. The main idea is that as Jews, we want to make sure that no matter how we approach it, no matter how we see that person, we want to see them as a person, right? No matter what their choices are, we still want to come at it with that same idea that we are godly people and that this person is a person. They are making their choices, but they are still people. And so no matter where we're at in terms of our beliefs of that particular experience of that person, we still want to come at them with empathy. Daryl and Sherry had a thought as well.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody, there's another element here, and we should remember Rabbi Tarfon's statement. Whatever we do, we just do the best we can. And we may never complete the task, but we just do our best and basically hand off to the next generation or next person.
Absolutely. And the sad truth of the matter is there are so many levels of social and economic justice that if you don't wish to engage with the homeless issue because of X, Y, or Z belief, the job is not done when it comes to racial justice. The job is not done when it comes to anti-Semitism and working in the schools. And the job is not done when it comes to justice in colleges. And so there are so many ways that we as Jews can engage with social justice in the ways that are meaningful to us. And so absolutely, it is not our task to finish, nor is it our task to cease. Right? We just move forward in that, right? So that, yes.
Another thought occurred to me, and that is that the problems have gotten much worse as the family, the institution of the family has kind of gone south in many percentages and ways. And I think the more that we could encourage religion, Judaism or Christianity or specifically, because if you have more people who do attend their congregations, and you get more stability in the families, you get less divorce, you get, and better raised children. They're not raised on the street, which is not a good thing. So I think that's a kind of a thing. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's going to generate. It's a generational change. But in this one generation, we've gone from mostly people married to an awful lot of people that either are having kids without getting married or not having kids, all that stuff. So it's a different demographics these days.
Certainly. And what I would say to that is that's, and I see that I see your hand up in a minute, is that could be an action that the Jewish community can be involved in, encouraging young families to come together, encouraging more singles programming in which they're actually coming and getting involved and learning about how we address, both social justice and community-based activism and communal programming and who we are as a community. That absolutely is something that the Jewish community can get more deeply involved in. Yeah, one more comment from the Nefts.
Okay, I'd like to mention how some of these goals could have been accomplished, or the ideal of accomplishing some of these goals by, it wasn't very popular at that time, but how could we end of all public schools to try to end segregation by getting students who live in various locations where segregation was very popular, not popular, but prominent, with busing. And that was not a popular way to do it, but it happened in the 60s, I remember, because people protested busing here and busing there. They didn't like to move populations all over the place. They felt it was uncomfortable, but it happened, and they changed people who lived in very poverty areas and didn't have opportunities the same as children who lived in better neighborhoods, so-called better neighborhoods, to get better education. So that's how it was tried to get more education for students who didn't live in the same neighborhoods by busing. And this was tried, but it was very it was not a happy way to do it, but they tried it. So it was a goal, but it wasn't the ideal way to do it. And they tried to bus students from one area to another, all over town, all over. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was one way. A lot of times you have to throw things against the wall and see what sticks, right? To see what's going to be the best and most effective. So when it came to the actual March on Washington, going back historically, so we're jumping back again. During the March on Washington, we obviously hear the I Have a Dream speech, right? We hear many things, but before Martin Luther King speaks, the crowd heard Rabbi Joachim Prinz. He was the president of the American Jewish Congress. He was an anti-Nazi dissident who was expelled from Germany. And many things that he said really really resonated. So we can listen to a short.
I wish I could sing. I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to the great demonstrations in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, He created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the black people of America that motivates us. It is, above all, and beyond all such sympathies and emotions, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience.
So he continues on for a number of minutes and really roots justice work in our past. We didn't get to too much of the fun stuff, but as we move forward and we talk more about the march, people were not only lifted by these Jewish speeches, but also by Jewish voices and writers and musicians. Very prominent folk writers and musicians were a part of this march. So, for example, Joan Baez performs "We Shall Overcome," and a little later, next week, we'll explore that and the lyrics and kind of where that comes from, and we'll listen to it. And Peter, Paul, and Mary sing Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind," which becomes a bestseller. Like, it's #2 on the Billboard charts, their version, right before this march. And so we'll end there with just kind of listening to them at the march on Washington, singing this song. And then next time we'll get together and we'll really talk about the music of this time frame. So now we've talked about the words, we've spoken about the impetus for justice in Judaism and working through the ways in which we can act with compassion, with empathy. And then we're going to listen to the music of it and really dive into that. So let's see if we can get this to play. Perhaps.
Relationship. And now, a group of singers who have come to help express and sung what this great meeting is all about. I give you now Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
I started to sing, and I had an epiphany. Looking out at this 250,000 people, and I truly believed at that moment it was possible that human beings could join together to make a positive social change.
How many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many years must a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea?
And then all of a sudden, the lyrics are coming out, you know? And how many years will it take before people can be free? And you're thinking, wow, this is it. This is the integration of everything that you sing and you feel strongly, and the moment.
There was a breakout in the thinking, a desire to say, let us think for ourselves independently. We won't be the instrument of somebody else's intent, but we will really be a different kind of people living in a different kind of society.
The answer is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
We
So we'll get more into who Peter, Paul, and Mary were and those Jewish connections. Obviously, we have Peter Yarrow, son of Ukrainian immigrants, many different interviews he has credited his Jewish ancestry for much of his activism. And so we'll talk more about him and the three of them, their choice to sing Blowin' in the Wind, and how deeply rooted it is in the pursuit of justice at our next session. So I thank you all for joining me today. And we will absolutely continue our exploration of justice music in the coming months till Tiny Human arrives. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.
It was a lovely way to